Hello, I'm Melissa Platt, Executive Director for Mental Health Association of San Mateo County. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm extremely pleased to introduce our host and our speaker for today for the final event of our series on schizophrenia. Angie Coiro, an award-winning radio interviewer, is also the host of the syndicated radio show In Deep with Angie Coiro. We're delighted that she is hosting all of the episodes of MHA's Storyteller Series. Today, Angie will be in conversation with Miriam Feldman, an artist, writer, mental health advocate, parent of an adult son with schizophrenia, and the author of a powerful book titled He Came In With It. Please welcome Angie Coiro and Miriam Feldman.
Melissa, thank you so much. Miriam, welcome. This is a pleasure. Oh, and I think we've got you on mute there, Mimi.
Thank you. I am glad to be here.
I want to start with what everyone is going to start with. When they pick up the book, that's the portrait they're going to see. And I thought perhaps, because you're an artist, your husband is an artist, I thought perhaps one of you had painted that. But in fact, your son, Nick, who we're going to be talking about, painted that himself. When did he do that? And tell me what you see that he sees there.
He painted that self-portrait when he was about 16. He was a prodigious kid from day one. He has a prodigious talent, and you could see it was evident from the very beginning. And that was a self-portrait that he did that I always kept because it was so powerful. And then when it came time to pick the artwork for the cover for the book, I was at first hesitant to use it because I thought I really want his face plastered all over books everywhere. And then once I saw what the different artists had come up with, and they were all lovely, but suddenly I had this moment of clarity where I realized it really couldn't be any other image except that. You know, there's something about this portrait. It captures him, and it has kind of a prescient element to it. You look in his eyes, you look in his face, you know something's not right. Mm-hmm. And I was really pleased that the publishers wanted to use it, so we did.
About that time when he was 16, were you starting to see yourself that things weren't right?
Well, you know, if you were to make a list of red flags for serious mental illness and a list of normal teenage behavior, you'd have virtually the same list. You know, they behave like crazy people. They're irrational, they're impulsive, they're combative, they're difficult to understand. And so for a while, I went along thinking, okay, well, he's just like all the other kids. But then all the other kids continued to grow and move out of it and become productive, and Nick didn't. Mm-hmm. And I realized something was going on, but really it's a real learning curve. There's a couple of years where crazy behavior is what's the norm.
Mm-hmm. Where did you start to see that separate? Where did you start to see that what as a teenager was pulling away from what he was going through?
Well, it came from a very drastic act. There was a suicide attempt, and it wasn't, as the doctor called it, it was an inauthentic suicide attempt. You know, he didn't risk dying, but he had cut his wrist. And it was, at that point, we had to start regarding it as something serious. Mm-hmm. But what we did is we ended up for a good couple more years dealing with it as a substance abuse problem. Because what happens is all the kids are also smoking pot and trying different drugs and things like that. But what Nick was doing was self-medicating. And since I didn't know at that point the mental health component of it, that he had a serious mental illness, we thought he was doing drugs and he was doing too many drugs. And so we approached it and treated it that way for a good another year and a half.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about what you and your husband were bringing to the table at that point, your understanding of mental health. He had mental health issues behind him in his family. So later in the book, you find out that he's been more concerned, that concern had been more to the forefront than you had realized throughout your entire journey. When this all started, what context was he putting the mental health issues in his family into?
Well, the whole process is kind of this process of digging ourselves out of this hole. And also educating ourselves, because there were things in our families, in his family, that now I see, of course, these are serious mental health issues, but at that point we were so ignorant. I mean, I hesitate to even use the word naive. We were ignorant and we didn't identify anything. And then as time went along and we realized what we were dealing with, within a marriage, this is a very hard thing to process. And a lot of marriages with kids like this end up in divorce. And I think it was kind of just under the surface for a long time, the finger pointing of, aha, it comes from your family, the guilt of, oh my God, it came from my family. And as it evolved and we learned, we had to face up to and deal with those issues as well.
Mm-hmm. I had to laugh. This is, of course, the last of a 4-part series. And our very first guest was Nathan Filer. He talked about how the one thing that comes up again and again in people's trip from ignorance to understanding about schizophrenia, he brought up One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he said that is always coming up. So as far as what you were bringing to the table, that was part of your context for schizophrenia. And that's incredibly common.
Very much so. And, if you read Dr. E. Torrey Fuller's book, Surviving Schizophrenia, and he is the gold standard on this subject. He's the guru. At the end of the book, that was the first book I read. And at the end of the book, he lists in a glossary form, the 10 worst things that ever happened for mental illness in the history of this country. And he includes that book because he feels that it was completely detrimental. And I agree with him now. And, it's very interesting because I'm an artist. My husband's an artist. We sort of embrace quirky, weird behavior. I mean, that's what artists do. That's how we are. And what happened in that book is, I mean, it's a great book and it was a great movie, but it portrayed mental illness in a way that isn't really true, in that it didn't contend with the seriousness of it. Mm-hmm. And it portrayed the people, the inmates, if you will, in the mental asylum as, these quirky, interesting, funny guys that went against the zeitgeist and the common culture and were living their own life, but they became sort of anti-heroes. And then Nurse Ratched became the evil one. Now, I bought into that 100% when I saw the movie, but years later, when I became Nurse Ratched, I realized there's a whole other set of circumstances there, and we need to be aware, and we can't idealize or fantasize what serious mental illness is. It's not quirky, it's not funny, it's a disease, and it's serious, and these people need their medication. And what Dr. Torrey said is that at the end of the book, everybody applauds when is it the chief who leaves? He gets out. Everybody applauds, and isn't it wonderful? He got out. He's free now. And in reality, what would end up happening was within 6 months, he would either be on the streets, in jail, or dead. Mm-hmm. He didn't go back to some wonderful life that was waiting there for him. There is no place in our culture, in our society, for people with serious mental illness. So that's a misnomer, and we need to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. You also bring up an important concept. When you're dealing with schizophrenia, there's an element called anosognosia. And that is one of the curses of schizophrenia is the primary person dealing with symptoms will not admit there's something wrong or really doesn't perceive there's anything wrong. So I want to back up a little bit to Nick's own story. He was starting to go downhill. His defiance was more and more marked. His attention to his own well-being, his own, whether he was unkempt or not, started to go downhill. Did he at any point, when he was still young, acknowledge that something was going wrong in him as opposed to the world outside of him?
When I did the forensic work necessary for writing the book, I found things. At the time, I didn't perceive any acknowledgement from him. And, you know, anosognosia is really, you corrected yourself, and it's a very important differentiation. It's not that you won't admit that anything's wrong. It's the inability to understand that something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the single most difficult element of schizophrenia when you're trying to help somebody. And but I look back on it now and I read his writing, a lot of which is in the book, and there are pleas for help. There are acknowledgments that he's screwing up and that he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, but there's not a real conscious awareness of serious mental illness. You know, he's 35 now, and honestly, it's only in the last year that he's gaining insight, and that's because of the medication change.
Mm-hmm. Is that insight consistent, or does it come and go?
It's pretty consistent now.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, he's changed to clozapine, which is the only medication for schizophrenia that addresses the negative symptoms. And I'm sure since you've been talking to people, you know, I'm the last in this series, you've gone over this, but just for anybody who doesn't know,
Please.
with schizophrenia, there are two sets of symptoms, the positive and the negative. Now, the positive are not anything that we would consider positive in a good way. They're positive in that they are features that are added to the person's personality, sensibility, delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, grandiosity, all these things that are added. And the negative symptoms are the things that are taken away. And that is anosognosia, the inability to know that you're ill, ahedonia, the inability to feel pleasure or feel joy, motivation, wanting to have connection with other people, you know, basically what they call the flattening affect, which turns them into kind of zombies. And then most of the medications just add to that. Clozapine is the one medication that addresses that and offers a hope for meaningful recovery.
There's another thing that your story has in common with so many others, and that is that morass of diagnoses you have to go through. And that's not putting any fault on the people doing the diagnosing, doing the assessment. It's a very difficult condition that presents itself that can masquerade as anything else. What was his litany of diagnoses?
Well, you know, I have to say, we can put a little bit of blame on the people doing the assessing, because but I don't think it's the individuals, it's the system and the way the system is set up, because the system is not set up to incorporate and seek out the information that the ancillary people in the family can bring. And so there's a lot of mistakes and a lot of wrong avenues gone down, because, you know, a doctor sits with a patient for 15 minutes in a month and then makes an assessment without all the germane information that a mother or a spouse or another family member can bring, because by and large we're shut out, and that's by the system. But with Nick, what happened was, first it was addressed as a drug problem, then it was addressed as anxiety, then depression, then eventually he was diagnosed bipolar, and finally when he was just about 20, schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm. What did that word say to you immediately? When I read the book, it almost sounded as though you were ready to embrace it. By the time you got to that word, it was affirming some of the things you had already thought.
Well, yeah, it was so many years. It was such an arduous and frightening process, and all you want is an answer. And the one that really knocked me off the ledge was when he was diagnosed with bipolar, because things like depression and anxiety, while I'm not minimizing the horrible impact it can have on a person's life, there are medications, there are treatments that can be highly, highly effective, and these people can have a hope of a life. When he was diagnosed bipolar, I really thought, this is a serious mental illness. This is not something that we're going to revert back to the original track with. We're on a different track now. And by the time he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, it was like, well, here we go. You know, we went to the far end of the spectrum, and it was just a relief to just know what it was and be able to move forward with that knowledge. Not that that's what I wanted by any means.
Right. What was his reaction when he got that diagnosis?
Oh, he had no acknowledgement of it at all. You know, it was many, many, many years. I mean, like I said, really, he's 35 now. It's really only in the last couple of years. You know, I've tried and I continue to try through all these years. I will say schizophrenia. I will talk about it. He wouldn't even say the word. You know, even now that he knows he has it, he'll sometimes revert back and say, you know, just last weekend we were jogging and he said to me, you know, I like to think that what I really have, it's more depression and anxiety, Mom, you know, and I think that I want to move back to that. You know, it's such a scary word. It's such a scary idea that people don't want to even talk about it.
Mhm.
You know, I've said that I feel like schizophrenia is the bastard child of mental illness. You know, there's all this media campaigns and awareness campaigns and public service announcements about mental illness and stigma and accepting it and being open about it. And that's all good. It's all really good. And I'm glad it's happening. But there is a distinction between those mental illnesses and SMI, serious mental illness.
Mhm.
And the mental illnesses that cause psychosis and disrupt your life on such a fundamental level are in a different category. And it is my opinion that the spending, the dollars spent on education and awareness campaigns and research and everything are inversely proportionate or in to the more serious the mental illness becomes, the less money that goes there. There's millions of dollars going to talking about stigma and being okay to admit that you're going to psychiatrists. And like I said, that's all well and good, but those of us who are here in the trenches dealing with SMI are like, where is the money for the hospital beds? Where is the money for the research? Where are the medications? Where are the trials? Okay, it's good that we're trying to eliminate stigma, but quite honestly, when you have a kid with schizophrenia, stigma is the last thing on your mind. You're so far, you know, down the rabbit hole that you're not, you know, you don't have time to worry about stigma. You're trying to keep your kid alive.
Mhm. Do you wonder if well, I'll bet you know, I'll bet you don't have to wonder about whether the fact that people highlight in the campaigns and in where the money goes, that it's going to illnesses that are more socially acceptable. When someone is depressed, you can misunderstand that as an empathetic person. And you can say, oh yeah, I've had my down moods too. It's wrong. That's not what you're talking about, but there is an element of empathy there. You can perceive yourself in that other person's shoes. And when you're talking about serious mental illness, those are, quite frankly, to a lot of folks, those are the scary people. Those are the people we can't empathize with.
That's where the education comes in. And that's where also, honestly, I don't care if they empathize with him. I just want the money to go to research. I just want them to have the hospital beds. I just want this to change the system so that he's treated. You know, there's the Schizophrenia and Related Disorders Association of America. They just recently changed their name, and they're working very hard to have it redesignated as a neurological disorder and not a mental illness, and deal with the actual physical medical condition that it is. And I think that being able to, I think you made a perfect point about being able to understand and comprehend. And the thing about schizophrenia is it's not pretty. Schizophrenia is really ugly, and it's not a sad person with a dark cloud over them that you can understand. You know, I used to drive down the street and I would see the guy standing on the corner screaming at nobody there. And I would think to myself, where is his mother? Like, what the hell? How does this happen? Why? Where is his family? Where is his mother? Well, then when the guy screaming on the corner was my son, and I'd already spent several years contending with this joke that we call a mental health system, I understood where his mother was. His mother was on her knees somewhere, beaten down, not knowing what to do, because it's it's an impossible system to navigate. I'm something of a pit bull. And I also am privileged. I'm white. I have a good education. I have a certain amount of resources. I am able to fight for him in a way that I think Black and brown moms probably can't. And plus they have to live with the fear of putting themselves between their child and the system. Also creates the opportunity or the possibility that their kid ends up shot by the police or something like that. So there's so many things in the way of even getting to the point of beginning meaningful recovery that they give up. And so I don't think that it's our job to necessarily make schizophrenia an empathetic thing that people can empathize with or understand. I think that we just have to buck up and do it. You know what I mean? Nobody spends any time trying to make people understand how ugly and horrible cancer is. We just give the money to the research and we try and save people. Why aren't we doing that with people who have schizophrenia?
I want to come back to what the mental health system is doing, especially you had experience with Kaiser. We're going to talk about the laws that have chased that inadequacy. I also want people to know that you can put your questions into the chat box. I won't have a chance to read paragraphs, but if you want to put a concise question in there, I'll bring that over to Mimi as well. The story we haven't touched on, Mimi, is that we're looking at the progression of your son, getting worse and worse, trying to deal with his own symptoms, trying to deal with the world that has turned hostile to him. What we haven't touched on yet is your transition from being Ridgewood Place mom, what you thought you were, what you thought you could be, and moving on from there. Who was Ridgewood Place mom?
Well, you know, my husband's an artist, I'm an artist. We've always been a little bit in the margins, but we moved into this nice, you know, nice community in Los Angeles, filled with, you know, nice middle-class families. And I sort of felt like this is where I wanted to belong, and this is what I wanted to color my life with. And, you know, when Nick got sick, it became increasingly more evident that we really didn't fit in there. And I spent a lot of time in the beginning trying to pretend that everything was okay, you know, trying to put a good face on it, trying to minimize what was going on, trying to keeping up with the Joneses. But, you know, eventually, not too long into it, when the police are on your porch and the helicopters are buzzing and they're dragging your kid away in handcuffs, you can't put a good face on it anymore. And that's when you abandon the idea of worrying about stigma. But I also continued to do that within my family, which was very detrimental to my other kids. I have 3 daughters and 2 of them are younger than Nick. So they were still very young. My youngest one was only 11 when this all started. And, you know, I ran around pretending, trying to make everything normal and pretending everything was okay and hiding things. And needless to say, that wasn't good for my marriage. But what I found out now that my girls are adults is that it made them crazy because they could see what was going on. They knew something was seriously wrong. And I would just plaster this dumb smile on my face and pretend everything was okay. And I really wouldn't recommend doing that to anybody because it didn't make it worse. It made it harder for them.
And to some extent, you protected your husband as well from what was going on.
Oh, very much so. You know, it was just, I thought, you know, I'm kind of a proactive controller person. And I just thought I could fix this. This is my son. I grew him in my belly. Not only can I fix this, but it's my job to fix this. And I operated under that banner for many years. And also that was futile because it's not fixable. It's not even about fixing it. It's about learning acceptance. It's about meeting him where he is. It's about finding and creating a place in the world for him while trying to give the most meaningful recovery that you can for him. But it's just the concept of fixing it or hiding it is something that I also recommend that everybody just throw in the trash as soon as they possibly can, because it just wastes your energy.
You know, it's interesting that early on in the book, you bring up what used to be considered the fact is that if you had a schizophrenic child, you were a refrigerator mother, you were cold, you were not empathetic. It's the mother's fault. And even though you dismissed that early on in the book, I watched you struggle with that throughout, because as you just said, this is your flesh and blood, your creation. This is your job. And over the course of the book, we watch Rose, one of the younger daughters growing up, and she went into her tailspin into her own hell. And at one point you said she hadn't gotten the mother the other kids had. Ridgewood Place mom, confident, strong, attentive. She's gotten broken mom. And I intend to fix that. At that point in the book, say 3/4 through, did your intention to fix things have a more informed, more realistic motivation behind it? Did your idea about fixing things kind of evolve as you went along?
It's so funny that you pointed that out. I never realized I used that word again. The way through the book. Okay. I guess it is something that you still try and do. You know, what I was trying to do at that point was fix my mistakes. You know, make it up to her. But it is something in the way that we're wired, I think, as mothers. I mean, there's just such a fundamental sense of responsibility for them. I think it's easier, actually, well, in my experience with my husband and with the men that I've met along the way here, it's easier, I think, for them to pull back from it because they can't deal with it. But I mean, think of the idea of this refrigerator mother thing. Think of that. You have this beautiful son who you nurtured through his adolescence, and you have all these dreams and hopes for, and all of a sudden one day he disappears in front of your eyes. He just disappears into himself and he's gone, and he has this terrible disease and nobody knows what to do, and you don't know how to get treatment, and you're working in this against this horrible broken system, and then on top of everything else they tell you, well, it's your fault that he has this because you weren't a good enough mother. You weren't loving enough. You weren't warm enough. I mean, my God, I think of the mothers back in the 50s, the mother who actually was also named Mimi from Hidden Valley Road. I mean, can you imagine having that on top of everything else put on you? And I think that there's a part of me, and that there's a part of all the moms, that, because now I know so many moms, people reach out to me, I write with people. And on some level, I think on some level, I'll always feel like somehow it was my fault. I don't think there's a way to shake that.
I want to recap for people who are listening. You mentioned 2 books, and I just want to put them both out there. Surviving Schizophrenia by Dr. E. Fuller Torrey. That's Torrey. And the one you just mentioned was the family who had so much schizophrenia in there.
Oh, Hidden Valley Road by Robert Cole.
Valley. That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, that's really an amazing book.
So I have a giant face mask.
Oops, somebody's got their microphone open.
I'm not sure about that. I can ask Robert. I need some backup.
Well, maybe our host can mute that.
Okay.
Okay. All right,
Please.
let's continue. So all this while you
Yeah, they're reusable. And then also, you can watch these. Yeah. Do you want one?
I'm looking for which person that might be, so we can get them to mute it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about the Giants. I didn't hear about that. Like this one.
Oh boy, this is terrible.
Yeah, it'll be good for the weather. Okay. All right. Yeah, you too. Have a good day.
I didn't see which person that was. So just for anybody who's returning to your keyboard, please make sure that you are on mute, because we just heard a lovely conversation you were having with someone at the door. All right, so let's go on about your professional life. You're a painter both for your artistic fulfillment and as a commercial painter.
Yeah.
Your husband is also an artist. Talk about the impact on your life as both a productive producer of money, which every household needs, and as someone who paints for her soul, which you also do. What was happening to that as this went along?
I had my ups and downs. You know, I had periods of time where I didn't feel like painting, or it was all too much. But I mean, as somebody who's been engaged in art making for, you know, 55 of my 65 years. There are ups and downs, and so I go with that. And it's so much a part of what I do and who I am that it wasn't disrupted by this. It was difficult to continue running a business, having a bunch of employees, having 3 other kids, having a marriage, having a life, and having all of it. I mean, it was impossible. And so there were some years where I think I just was in damage control mode all the time, and that's all I did, is just try and keep all the balls in the air. So anything that I did artistically or whatever, I wasn't even really paying attention to. I was just trying to keep the boat afloat. And then I reached a point a few years in where Nick was compliant with his medication. Things had calmed down a bit. And I had a moment to catch my breath. And I thought, okay, this is it. I will just keep this machine running for the rest of my life, and then I'll die. And that's my life. And there was like a little voice going, no, wait a minute. And I just thought, I've worked so hard. I'm a really hard worker, and I have so many ideas and dreams and things. And I realized I've worked so hard to create this life. Now, obviously, it's not going to be what I thought it was going to be, and I have to let go of that. But I don't get to ever be happy. I don't get to ever have fun. I mean, what good is that for Nick? And what good is that for my daughters? And is that even fair? It's not fair. And why do I have to choose that? So I embarked on my own little journey, which ended up being, of all things, something that I never thought I would get involved in, because it all sounded too woo-woo for me. But I became a meditator, and I became a yogi, and I practice yoga and meditation every day. And it opened a door into this whole other way of living in the world, which built a bridge for me and enabled me to accept what had happened and live with it. I mean, I still have my moments of howling at the moon. There's no way that's not going to be, but acceptance and not fighting to change something that's unchangeable, and the fact that we get to be happy and have joy in spite of this, or with this. Nick and I laugh a lot together. Our family laughs a lot. We have gallows humor, granted, but there's a lot of joy there, and I just refuse to give that up.
There was a delicious little moment, and I just have to laugh, because I think a lot of people go through this when they give way to coping mechanisms that they heard about. No, that's woo-woo. I'm not going to do that. And there's this moment in the book where you go, sitting with your eyes closed for 20 minutes could be a good thing, which is that little aha moment. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, there are those moments. And, there's a moment in the book too that cracks me up, is when, I was telling, everybody knew I'm doing the meditation and the yoga. And it's so unlike my personality that the people who know me think it's kind of funny. And there's a time when I'm driving with Nick in the car, and it'd been a really trying day with him. And we're driving, and somebody cuts me off, and then somebody else cuts me off. And finally, I just roll down the window and let out this spew of obscenities at the guy who cut me off. And then Nick and I are sitting there with these obscenities sort of reverberating in the car. And Nick, who hadn't said a word the whole day, because he was still pretty psychotic then, just turns and looks at me and says, so how's that meditation going for you, Mom? And so there are those moments that are like priceless. And yes, I would never in a million years even consider bartering my newfound enlightenment and compassion and education and enjoyment of the world, any of that. I peel the skin off my body if I could take the schizophrenia away from Nick. But it's not without its gifts. It's not without its beauty. And I think that's why I wrote the book. And that's because, and for those of you, probably most of you who haven't read the book, it's not some depressing horror driven slog through the depths of hell. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of laughs, there's a lot of joy, there's a lot of beauty, I think. And I think that's what I wanted to put out there. This is the whole melange, it's all in there, but the beauty's not gone and the joy's not gone. We're just contending with a different set of circumstances now.
Mm-hmm.
That's important.
there are glimpses into Nick's soul that are really beautiful. And that as you go through this evolution of accepting what's going on with him, you have to figure out what's really gone and what you can still access, where he is in there. And there is a letter to his dad that he wrote that is just, it's so touching, and it shows the perception and the empathy that he has. Can you talk about both that letter that he wrote to his dad and how much of that Nick you can still see?
Well, you know, that Nick is really still here. It's something that I take a tremendous amount of comfort in, is that, you know, Nick is stricken with what can be arguably called the worst mental illness. It's about as bad as it gets. And it's not pretty. It manifests itself in ways that are ugly and frightening and, quite frankly, violent a lot of the time. And my son is a human being of such intrinsic goodness that even schizophrenia could not touch that. His goodness is intact. He may have episodes of anger, of smashing his, you know, holes in the wall, of smashing things, of throwing his body against the wall, but he's never hurt a fly. And his ability to empathize is starting to come back with the clozapine, which is miraculous. But even before the clozapine, while he may have been in a stupor, he may have been psychotic, he may have been a zombie, his goodness was still there. And he had moments of clarity and moments of lucidity where it was all still there. And he's always been solicitous and protective and loving of his sisters. And, you know, it's all still there. I don't see it as gone. It's just messed up. You know, it's just mixed in with this other stuff now. But I don't, to me, I don't see it as gone. And when you see these people on the street screaming and yelling, and it's so scary. And I mean, believe me, it's scary for me too. Just please keep in mind that they're in their own hell. This isn't something that they've chosen. They're not weak of character. They're not bad people. They are tormented, and they are by and large untreated. You know, it wouldn't be pretty to walk down the street and see people being ravaged by cancer lying around on the streets, but we as a society don't do that to people with cancer. We do that to people with serious mental illness, and it's an abomination. So these are people who are suffering from a horrible disease, and our society is turning our back on them. So at least have a moment of compassion. Maybe it's not something you can recognize. Maybe it doesn't look like depression, but they have a horrible disease that they're suffering from.
AC asks, are there any extended times that Nick was inaccessible, homelessness, or disappeared for an extended period of time? And if so, how did you cope with that?
Well, luckily, through the trajectory of Nick's disease, it hasn't been too bad. You know, there were periods of time where he was homeless or we didn't know where he was, but I mean, that was more days, weeks kind of thing. You know, he's had many weeks of hospitalizations at a time. But early on, somebody said to me that I can't operate out of fear, that if I operate out of fear, I'm going to just always make the wrong decision. So very early on, I had a moment where I sat myself down and I had a little talking to, and I realized I had to, if not make friends with, at least acquaint myself with the idea that he could end up dead. And that it couldn't operate every moment of every day under that fear and that motivation of trying to avoid it, that he might just very well end up dead, and that I had to accept that that was one of the parts of the paradigm. And I did. And it's horrible. You know, I remember walking through the neighborhood and choreographing in my mind, running into somebody, stopping me and saying, "How's Nick doing?" And me saying, "Oh, didn't you hear? He died." And then, you know, I went through that. And I mean, it was the most horrible, painful exercise I ever did. But I don't walk around now worrying that he could die. They could all die. We could all die. We're all going to die. So it's just something you have to live with in a more acute way. But again, not without its gifts. When you are walking that fine a line, when you are that close to the reality of life and death, life takes on a real clarity and a real beauty. At least it has for me.
You went through your daughter Rose leaving. Rose had a lot of issues that she went through with how you were dealing and the impact of the family on what was going on with Nick. And she went on her own odyssey, and she was sleeping on park benches. And you were keeping kind of a tenuous relationship with her, but you didn't really want to push her. Plus, she was inaccessible sometimes. What did you bring from what you had learned from Nick to how you dealt with Rose?
You know, unfortunately, it wasn't a very good equation, because by the time it was time to deal with Rose, I was kind of destroyed. You know what I mean? I was just, that was the point at which I was just empty. That was the point at which I started yoga and meditation and learning all these things to try and refill myself and bolster myself. Honestly, what I went through with Rose in a lot of ways was more devastating than what I went through with Nick, because there was the element of, oh my God, is another one going down? And also, I can't do this again. I can't do this again. But I managed to, and she's fine now. And I think in retrospect, I bring more information. I think at that time with Rose, what I did is, like I talked about in the book, is I just realized how much she had been marginalized and lost in the shuffle and not seen. And she was so angry at me. And I decided, I came up with my buckets of love theory. I decided that I was just going to throw buckets of love at her until she got it and she understood what had happened and how much I loved her. And so we would drive in the car and she would say, I hate you. And I would say, I love you. And she would say, I effing hate you. I wish you were dead. And I would say, well, nothing's going to change the fact of how much I love you. And we went for years like that. And there was just nothing she could do or nothing she could say that would change for 1 second my campaign of love. And finally, she got it. And that was all she needed. And that was all she needed from me. And we moved forward. And now I have miraculous relationships with my daughters. I mean, I cannot tell you how much it bolsters me and how much joy and how much I get out of my relationships with them. And they love me and they've forgiven me. And we've all moved through it in a very open-eyed way.
Mm-hmm. Delia wants to know, since your son had a history of substance use, do you have concerns he's engaged with substances as he lives alone? She has a son struggling with that as well.
It's a tough one. And, that's, it seems with schizophrenia, especially, they all want to smoke pot, and pot's a terrible, terrible drug for schizophrenia. And with Nick, I'm very lucky that he's very compliant, because I've set up a structure where he has caregivers and they give him his meds. And because he's on clozapine now, he has to have blood work done every week. So we do a tox screen. So I know he's not doing other drugs. So I'm very lucky. But Delia, I understand how impossible it is to deal with that, because they're doing, through the years, he would get like cold medicine, Corsedin or Robitussin, and get high off that. And, then they're just getting better. They're just getting some stability. And then they do that and it throws them into psychosis. And it's almost impossible to control. It's a very, very hard thing.
I couldn't help but notice, and you see this on the streets as well, this connection between serious mental illness and smoking.
Yeah.
And Nick's a smoker. And I looked this up, and not only is it more common among people with schizophrenia than it is in the larger public, it can actually do them more damage for some reason. And
well, what it is it's not actually that. There's a receptor, and I'm sorry, I can only paraphrase the science because
sure.
I'm not a scientist, but the nicotine addresses a similar receptor in the brain that has to do with schizophrenia in a way. And, Nick doesn't smoke anymore because
Oh,
he does vape, but he stopped smoking because the smoke gets in the way of the absorption of the clozapine. And so we worked really hard to get him back on that. But there is a connection. Virtually everybody with schizophrenia smokes.
mhm. And I wonder if with him, you've already answered part of my question, that it was, to make his meds more efficient. But in his case as well, at one point you were bargaining with him. And you can see a mom or a dad or both who are trying to get a child to comply with the things that will keep him alive and off the street. You'll do what you need to do that. And one point it turned into this system of bribing him with beer and cigarettes. And I guess I'm just wondering what your mind went through in terms of, look what I'm giving him to get him to do this. How did you work that out in your head?
The lesser evil, that sort of a equation. It was tough too, because I still had 2 little girls in the house. And, I remember being told at the very beginning when he was diagnosed with bipolar and put on medication, he didn't want to take it. And I remember asking the doctor, what if I paid him to take it? Would that be terrible? And the doctor said to me, all your preconceived notions about parenting, all your ideas about what's right and wrong are off the table. All that matters is getting this medication in him every day. You do what you have to do to get this, don't worry about Dr. Spock. You do what you have to do to get this medication in his body. So I started paying him $5 a day to take his bipolar medication. I mean, my daughters were furious. No one had ever paid them to take their amoxicillin, and they were just beside themselves. They were just disgusted and angry and didn't understand what was going on in this household, where they were being held to one standard and he was getting money for taking his medication. But it didn't matter. I understood so clearly what that doctor had said to me that I just proceeded with that. And that's what I've always done. You've got to, when you're dealing with this, you have to get your priorities really straight and know what you're doing is right, and everything else be damned. You're not answering to anybody else. You're answering to your child's health.
Mm-hmm. Warning from Nicola in the chat. She says people who stop smoking on antipsychotics may have to have their dose adjusted so there's not toxicity. And with that, and with everything else we're discussing, talk to your doctor. There's no prescribing of anything going on here. You need to talk to your med doc if there are any questions about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
We were talking about humor in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, it does turn into gallows humor, because here we are as a reader and we're following your life. You're hanging by a thread. You got your kids going over, and Nick is obviously his problem. You're trying to keep it all together. And there's this absolutely beautiful moment. People are watching you check out carts and carts of beer. And then one morning we watch you checking out some of the lowest level beer you can possibly buy that only people on the street would be seen drinking. And you're checking it out at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I did reading a couple paragraphs here. You had found out that the pills that you were about to bring him were supposed to have been cut in half. And now you're trying to do it with a nail clipper because you hadn't done that. I held the pill up in front of my face, squinting to focus, and slid it halfway into the clipper. It turns out that cutting a small pill in half with a nail clipper is harder than you'd think. I went through pill after pill. Some disintegrated, some went flying. I was in a frenzy. In the rearview mirror, I could see that my face was covered with white dust. Nice. At last I got one to cut. The other part went out the window. I saved half. Just at that moment, I looked up and saw 2 policemen walking past my car. This is what they saw. A middle-aged woman in tattered paint clothes with a nail clipper in her mouth and a big grin, white powder all over her face. Were you able to laugh at that moment, or is that one of those things where you have to laugh later?
You know what? Even at that moment, I knew it was funny. It was just ridiculous. And yesterday I got a letter from a woman, and this is what I love, and this is what makes me feel so sanguine about having written this book and getting it out into the world. I got a letter from a woman who said, that my book was a life-changing experience for her, to understand that somebody else was going through it in the same way that she was. Because I think that a lot of times it either gets sanitized or the stories are told and they're, you know, you're made into a superhero or, you know, and it's just like, I wanted to be real. And this woman wrote me about a thing that she said, something that just happened to her that week, where she had run into the store like a maniac to get the gum, you know, the Nicorette gum for her son, because he was quitting smoking and he was freaking out in the car, and she couldn't get through the line and she forgot her mask. So she put her hood over her face and she did it, and she ran out, and they followed her out because they thought she was shoplifting and she had to run back in. And I was laughing because it's like, that's like Wednesday. You know what I mean? It's just what we do all the time. And it makes your life kind of crazy, but also, I don't know, there's something funny about it. There is.
Yeah, there's gotta be.
Yeah, I don't mind that. And I'm glad to be talking about it, and I'm glad to be sharing it. And I'm, you know, when this first happened, in the beginning, I used to sit in my living room in my nice, you know, 100-year-old house in this nice neighborhood of LA and look out that window, and I felt like everybody else walking by had this clean, good life, and that my life was somehow tainted, that there was this dirtiness behind my front door that nobody knew about but us, and nobody else had but us. And I would sit there with such longing to just belong to the world again. But I had this, you know, this dark mark on me, on my family. And as the years have gone by, first of all, there's not a person that I talk to who doesn't have some connection. Talk about 6 degrees of separation. It's about 2 degrees of separation to something to do with mental illness. And we just have to accept that it's part of this world. You know, that's one of the things I talk about a lot when I give these talks, is that 1% of the population gets schizophrenia. That's a lot of people. How dare we take this huge segment of the population, of the world, of human beings, and say to them as a society, there's no place for you. We don't want you. The only thing we want to do is medicate you to the point where you're not a problem to us. And then it's totally fine with us if you just sit in a dark room or under a bridge or in a prison cell for the rest of your life. Just, you're not a problem to us. How dare we do that? These are human lives. What if we, again, I'm sorry to keep saying the cancer thing, but what if we did that to people with cancer or other diseases? I mean, it's an atrocity. Again, how dare we? So my position at this point is, I'm not asking for any favors of society. They're not doing Nick a favor. Nick has a right to a place in this world as much as I do, as much as you do, as much as everybody does. And it's a human rights issue. And it belongs right up there at the intersection of Black Lives Matter and all the different political things that we're going through right now. It's right in there. It's right at the intersection. And we need to make sure that it's seen and it's heard, because it's the same issue. Who are we to make decisions about which lives have more value than other lives?
That makes me curious. You work with Bring Change to Mind, which was started by Glenn Close because of her sister's issues. And I was looking through the advisory board and a lot of the others there, and I wonder how many people you have seen who are willing to take positions of advocacy, who are willing to fight for more power and more recognition, who haven't been touched by the disease. People who are doing it because they recognize that it's right, don't necessarily have schizophrenia in their lives. Do those people exist, or has everybody?
They do exist, and it blows my mind, because, you know, honestly, who the hell would want to involve themselves? I mean, who would pick this? There's a woman who, it's very funny because it turns out was my across the street neighbor in Hancock Park, and her name is Carrie Morrison. And years later, just in the last 2 years, we reconnected through a friend of a friend in the mental health world. And Carrie has nobody in her family dealing with this, but she worked in politics and she worked in the Chamber of Commerce and for the city of Hollywood. And she discovered this blight of seriously mentally ill people wandering the streets of LA. And she's committed herself, and she's created a nonprofit, and she's committed herself to working to right this wrong, and that's her full-time job now.
Wow.
And she has a podcast called Heart Forward, and I'm sorry, it's so hard for me to remember things off the top of my head, but I will send you the email to these links. If anybody's interested, you can send it out to the people after the fact. But she's doing it, and she has no connection to it. And there are other people like that who just have stumbled upon this and realized how wrong it is and have been called to help. But I think it's more people who it falls in their lap, and you just can't look away once it's in your life.
Got some questions piling up. What do you think of the idea that people with schizophrenia have to hit bottom after years of intervention, paranoia, anosognosia, and continued inability to find recovery when loved ones have done all they can do?
Okay. I have a big problem with using the phrase hit bottom. Honestly, a person with schizophrenia hitting bottom is death. That's the bottom. And when you say hit bottom, you're inferring that there's some sort of choice in the matter. Again, back to the cancer analogy. You wouldn't say to somebody with cancer that, well, you have to get to stage 4 before you're going to realize that you have this cancer. Schizophrenia prohibits you in many, many cases to understand that you're sick. So how in the world is hitting bottom going to give you awareness? That's like saying getting to stage 4 cancer is going to push you back to stage 1 by virtue of the awareness that you're at stage 4. Makes no sense. It is true what this person said, that there does come a point where family members, friends, clinicians have done everything they can do. And that's what I was talking about making friends with the idea that he may be the guy screaming on the street corner. Thank God that hasn't happened yet. It may happen still, but that is a thing that happens. So I think maybe the question is, you have to accept that you as a loving caregiver may hit the bottom, hit rock bottom, and there be nothing you can do. But the person with schizophrenia is not going to be helped by hitting rock bottom.
Well,
they're not going to be propelled into awareness.
Let's talk about how much you decide you will do. When Nick was in school, you were kind of the cheerleader. He was starting to evince symptoms. You didn't know what was going on yet. So you gave him that cheerleader talk, look, apply yourself to school, get through this, and then you can do X, Y, Z. So at that point, you were kind of cheerleading. Then you started kind of stepping in and doing things for him. And as we watch him grow older, he's living somewhere where he puts his fist through the wall, and you show up and you keep plastering the wall over, and he puts his fist through the wall and you plaster it over again. And then at some point, when the apartment is overwhelmed with roaches, you make him help you. He has to at least hold the bag while you clean everything up. So tell me that balancing line between insisting that he be involved and understanding he has limits.
Oh, that's the hardest one. It's a hard one to find. The thing about making him hold the bag for me as I'm scooping up, piles of cockroaches, I don't think that again propelled him to any greater understanding. I think that just helped me from wanting to jump off the building, to feel that I wasn't doing it alone. But there is a fine line, and that's something that we mothers do, that I have to really work on daily with myself, and that I get helped from the caregivers and from the other people in my life of holding him accountable and discerning to what degree I can hold him accountable, to what degree I can expect him to do things, and at what point I should pull back and let him try and do things. And then there's other things that it's just, you have to accept that they're never going to do it. And it's an equation that you have to constantly reevaluate and figure out. And first of all, the thing about schizophrenia is it's bespoke for each lucky recipient. So there's no rule book, there's no map, as I say in the book. You have to every day figure it out. And every day is different.
Question here, is it valid that people with schizophrenia have a right to choose illness when it's not a choice? It's likely they're not choosing it, but they think they're choosing it.
Well, see, this is the thing, and this is where, you know, there's so many people at odds within the world of mental health. You know, a lot of the things that I believe and say are not particularly embraced and loved by NAMI and some of the other groups. You know, I'm a little more of a renegade about certain things, you know, and then there's the whole faction of the mental health world that is fighting for what they call these people human rights, which are the rights to refuse medication. And what I say is, think about this. Think about your parent having Alzheimer's or dementia. Well, if your parent doesn't know that they're sick and they have such dementia that they can't care for themselves, nobody has a moral dilemma about stepping in and taking care of their parent. Nobody says, this person has a right to sit in their own feces in a dark room and starve to death. The police come, the paramedics come, the doctors help, the doctors work with you as the adult child of this person. That's how it should work, because that person clearly can't take care of themselves. But if you flip the script, and it's me as a mother talking about my adult child, all of a sudden a hip is dancing around telling you that they can't talk to you and they can't tell you anything. And people are talking about your son's rights to sit in his own feces till he dies. Well, I'm sorry, that does not fly with me. You can't talk about a person having the right to make a decision for themselves when they are incapable of the cognizant activity to make a decision. You wouldn't let somebody who was falling down drunk decide on their whether they were going to have surgery or not. You would have a proxy come in and make that decision for them, because they're not in a state of mind where they can do that. So to say that people who are in psychosis should be allowed to choose to be in psychosis is an absurdity.
Ironic little side note here. What you just heard on my side was, that's my meds alarm going off. So I just thought you'd be amused by that. I'll take my meds after the session. But I do want to talk too about, we talked about what's still inside Nick, who he still is, but you have to go through some mourning for what he isn't anymore. There's a Bob Dylan shirt. Bob Dylan signed the shirt for him. And it's because amongst this, you know, rabid group of fans, and they're all yelling and, hey, Bob, and blah, blah, Nick bowed to him, which shows what kind of a unique kid he was at that age. He just bowed to him. And Dylan came over and talked to him and signed the shirt. And that's not who Nick is anymore. He's not that cognizant. He can't go to a Bob Dylan concert and be on his own. So talk about the power of things. You have his paintings, you have the Bob Dylan shirt. How do they play their part in your laying to rest what you don't have and moving forward into what you do have?
Well, you know, they're talisman. They're things that I hold and that have meaning to me, and that remind me. But honestly, although for many years I felt like Nick was gone and this was over, and, you know, we would never be able to reclaim these parts of him, I don't necessarily believe that now. You know, I know that Nick will never have the life that he would have had if he hadn't gotten sick. I mean, there's 20 years of developmental growth he missed out on. You know, you can't make that up. But honestly, I believe he absolutely still is the young boy who bowed down and got that shirt. And you know, the other day we were driving in the car, and it was a good day. He was good, he was engaged, we'd had a great day together, we'd gone jogging and done a bunch of things. And on the way home, we were listening to Buffalo Springfield on the radio. And music is really a place where, you know, that music of that time is it's a fulcrum in my family. You know, it's something that is a big part of our lives, especially Bob Dylan. But we're listening to the music, and he still remembers, like he remembers. It'll come on and I'll go, do you remember who this is? And he remembers who everybody is. And so we're listening to it. And I thought to myself, well, you know, there's so many things in my life that didn't work out the way I thought they were going to. But this is still Nick. And I can still drive fast in my car down the freeway with him, listening to Buffalo Springfield, grooving on the music and getting it in this world with my son, and he's still here, and that's not nothing. And it's a matter of accepting how people may be different than you thought they were going to be. You know, the big turning point for me was way back when my daughter was very young. And what I used to do back in the days when I was trying to hide everything, especially hide everything from the girls, is I would pretend everything was fine during the day. And then after dinner, when everybody was settled down, I would go in the bathroom and I would turn on the shower, excuse me, and I would lie down on the bathroom floor and I would just cry where nobody could hear me, which was a joke because of course they did know. And then I would come out and I would be fine. And one day I walked out of the bathroom, boom, right into my youngest girl. And she said to me, "Mom, why are you crying?" And I said, you know, I was busted. I couldn't hide it. And I said, "Well, I'm crying because I miss your brother." And she said to me, "What do you mean you miss my brother? Nick's not gone. He's still here." And I said, "Yeah, but he's not who he was supposed to be." And my 11-year-old looks me in the eye and says, "Yeah, he is. It's just not what you thought." And it was like, boom, you know, she strutted off. I sat down in the window seat and it was like somebody had hit me over the head with a hammer. And I realized that's the thing. It's not about what I thought it was supposed to be. This is an extension of you want your kid to be a doctor and he ends up being a jockey. Well, you accept it because he is who he is. Well, this is the same thing. It's not what I thought, but this is who Nick was supposed to be. And that's what the title of the book is about, because this is what I realized in that moment is this is how he came to us. I may not have been able to see it at the time when he was born or when he was a little boy, but this is Nick O'Rourke. This is how he came to me. And I damn well better learn how to be his mother, not my idea of the trajectory his life was supposed to take. And so my 11-year-old gave me that slap across the face that woke me up. And I returned to that. You know, she's 28 now. I return to that often. It's not that he's not who he was supposed to be. This is who he was supposed to be. And the title he came in with it comes from, at one point, you know, periodically I go into these frenzies of trying to figure out why this happened, get to the root of it. So I was in one of these frenzies and I have a friend who does these very intricate, involved astrological charts. And she'd always offered to do one for him. And I don't particularly believe in that stuff, but I was desperate. I thought, okay, I'm going to call Shannon and ask her to do the chart. So I called her, I gave her all the information. She called me back the next day and I answered the phone and she said, "Mimi, he came in with it. Every single marker, every single sign in his astrological chart to designate mental illness is there. It was there from the moment he was conceived." And again, I don't necessarily believe in astrology, but that gave me a certain amount of peace. And I do believe in the basic tenet that this is who came to me. This is who I brought into the world. And I need to respect that and not try and change it. I can try and help him. I can hurt for him, but I don't get to be disappointed that he's different than what I thought I was going to get.
At the danger of your telling your husband's story, it's his story, obviously. But you did realize when you were talking to him once that his fear of mental illness in his family had come to the forefront. Yeah. And it was more profound than you thought it was. How did you help him? How did he get to that point where he could confess it to you? And how did you help him deal with that?
Honestly, I haven't helped him deal with it. It's his to deal with. I can't help it. I mean, if I could fix it, I would, but you know, we each have to wrestle with our own demons. It took a long time. And you know, it's in the book, that whole sequence when he finally said it to me. And it was a moment of enlightenment for me, because I was like, duh, why didn't I see this? Of course, this is what he's going through. And it's that constant, you know, idea of stopping and thinking what other people are going through and not running it through the filter of, you know, how it is for you. But what it's done for me is it's allowed me to allow him to be who he is.
Mhm.
and not expect him to be the father that I wish he was for my son. And that's painful for me because he's not as engaged with Nick as I wish he was, but it's too painful for him. And again, this is who I married, this is who I made Nick with, this is who I chose. So I have to deal with these things. He's doing the best he can, and that's all we can each do. But it's excruciatingly painful for him
Mhm.
because he feels responsible, and he also feels that Nick is a reflection of himself in a way that I think men do with their sons differently than we do as women.
Mhm. Mhm. Question from Melinda. Who are the caregivers? She's asking about the present. What's their job description? How to get Nick to accept them? Where do you find them? What do you pay them?
Well, this is like the miracle of miracles. When we left LA and we moved up here to Washington, I split my time now between LA and Washington. I still go down there and work every month, but we moved Nick up here. And as I was starting to acquaint myself with the system up here and, you know, getting him enrolled and everything, I stumbled across, now I don't know how this varies in different states, because unfortunately we do have 50 different mental health care systems in this country. But up here in Washington, Nick was quite psychotic and really unable to care for himself. And he has DSHS, Department of Health and Family Services caregivers. Nick is on SSDI, so he's on Social Security Disability Insurance. And so he receives a few $100s a month for that. That helps pay for his apartment, and he gets some food stamps. We have to augment all of that. But part of being designated as permanently disabled is we qualify for these caregivers. And so these angels who work for, you know, barely minimum wage, and talk about people who have chosen to help people in this situation. You know, they take care of old people, infirm people, and people with mental illness, people with physical disabilities. And so they come every day and they spend an hour and a half with him, and they help him. They make sure he takes his meds, and they help him clean his apartment, and they help him with food preparation and things like that. And for me, this has been a gift from heaven. You know, I had 15 years of being Nurse Ratchet, where I couldn't go anywhere, I couldn't do anything. I had to show up twice a day at his apartment, put that medicine in his mouth, make him open his mouth and swallow it, and make sure he wasn't cheeking it. And now I've helped, and it's been a gift. And I would recommend to everybody to look into locally what's available for you, because this comes under his medical coverage.
Mhm. There's another way people can help. And when I'm making reference to these earlier interviews, I want everyone to know that you can go to the MHA San Mateo County website and find a link to all of these interviews. And there's a moment that Randy Kay talked about in our last interview, and there was a similar moment in your book. And it's this tiny lesson about how affirmation of who you are and who you have produced as a son comes from a stranger. In her case, it was a mental health person who really acknowledged what she was doing when she signed away some of her son's rights. And in your case, it was someone in a restaurant saying, you know, this is a good boy. We all like him and we're all looking after him. And at the risk of sounding goody two shoes, it's like if there's one lesson anyone can take away from that, is a kindness goes so far, and you don't know what the person you're extending that kindness to may be going through.
You know, it's so huge. And there's one thing that I do now is, like, when I'm walking down the street and there's a guy screaming at nobody, I make eye contact and I say, hey, how you doing today? Just to let him know I see him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, that to let him know that I'm in this same world here with him. And I think that that's really important. And I think the thing of these kindnesses and these recognitions, you know, those of us who are dealing with this, it can save your life. You know, there was the woman in the restaurant, there was Nick's first psychotic break. There was a woman who, she was a woman who folds the towels, and she was walking down the hallway. I was like a zombie. I couldn't function. My daughter Lucy was handling everything, and I was just wandering around this hospital. My son was being, you know, put on a 72-hour hold. I just didn't even know what was happening or what to do. And I was not being very effective. And suddenly this woman who I'd seen her with this big metal cart with all the towels on it, opened a closet door and pulled me into the janitor's closet, turned over a 5-gallon bucket and sat me down and basically schooled me. And she said, you know, my husband, I know what you're going through. My husband is like your son. He has the same thing. And basically she said to me, you can't sit around feeling sorry for yourself. He's all you've got. You've got to get out there and you've got to advocate for him. She said, don't waste time wishing this wasn't true. This is it now. And that helped me too. So I think the thing of reaching out and talking and seeing and acknowledging, it can't be underestimated.
Mm-hmm. I did promise that we'd talk about the mental health care system that you and everyone else, if this kind of issue gets thrown into. And one of the things that, at least here in California, that we were looking for help with was the Mental Health Equity Act, where people who provide services have to treat mental health the same way they do any other disease of the mind, disease of the body. And here in California, that didn't work out too well. And Kaiser had to be sued a couple of times. You talked about the inaccessibility of enough help at Kaiser, or even any help in some cases. And now there has been a new bill, SB 855, which has been passed. And I'm quoting the Mercury News here. Crucially, the new law, which updates and replaces California's previous mental health parity statutes, dramatically expands the number of conditions that insurers have to cover. Are you cynical about this kind of thing, or do you think we can take some hope from it?
Oh, I think we definitely take hope from it. You know, I mean, every step helps and is important. And I think that, you know, it doesn't mean the problem solved, but it's one step in the right direction. You know, we need to, there's a lot of really technical things that we need to do in terms of the laws to change them. And there's a lot of people working just tirelessly out there to implement these things. And if you keep your eye on the different mental health Facebook pages and things, you can hear about what's going on. And I would implore everybody to keep up on that. And, you know, when a senator needs to be called or a letter needs to go out, to do it, because the laws need to change. And that's hard to do.
If I'm taking you past your sphere of knowledge, just tell me. But you mentioned earlier that there's this patchwork of 50 different states and 50 different sets of laws. Have you looked into it all? How much authority the federal government has to do some of this regulation? Do they have a role here?
Well, it's so complicated, and I don't want to wade into it and then say something that's not accurate. But there are many people who that's what they're pushing for, is just federal laws that cover the whole thing and force the states to do things right. And again, back to the intersectionality of what is going on in our country right now. What I was talking about previously about Black Lives Matter and mental health and the police and all those things in that intersection. Well, there's an intersection of this idea of how much is the federal government supposed to control and run as opposed to the state governments. But we see what's happening with the state governments with voting rights. I mean, to some huge degree right now, we're seeing the individual states just going, forget it, we're going to do it our way. And if it's a bad way, too bad, that's what we want. And that's what's happening a lot with mental health too. So I think that the federal government, that's an issue that's involved in that too, that we need to pay attention to what's going on with voting rights right now, because this our mental health rights and our mental health system falls under that intersection as well.
Mm-hmm. We're just about time. We have to stop here. One more change for you on your page as an advisory council member at Bring Change to Mind, and that is Bring Change, the number 2 mind.org. You were asked about your favorite mental health books. We mentioned 2 earlier. I want to finish by talking about The Center Cannot Hold by Elin Sachs. Can you say a bit about that book and why you recommend it?
Well, Elin Sachs is, first she was like my, in a sense, not my nemesis, but I knew who she was and I read the book and I was like, this isn't fair. How can it be that she's a law professor at USC and she has schizophrenia, and Nick is sitting in a beanbag chair staring at a blank television screen all day, and he has schizophrenia. Why can't he have Ellen's kind of schizophrenia? You know, this isn't right. But then now I know her, and we're friends, and she's actually the one who recommended to me the clozapine, which has been a life changer for Nick. And that book is very important because it really tells a whole story that spans a generation. You know, Ellen's my age, so she's in her mid-60s, and this story starts when she's a young woman. And what she has been able to achieve and maintain and help and then put out there for other people is startling. I mean, it's incredible. And she works so hard and still does. And it's a story that will give you a great deal of hope and also a great deal of understanding for what this journey is like.
This has been fantastic. I'm so glad we added you to the series because you're a great one to close out.
Can
with.
I say one thing? I actually have the comments up, even though I wasn't going to. And I just want to say one thing. This Beth Crosswhite, it says, Mimi, I've been told to give tough love to our son. Have you experienced this? How do you respond? You know, that's just the most ridiculous thing that anybody can say to you. Tough love has no place in mental health treatment. It's just a non-issue. And just anybody who tells you that, just smile and nod and walk away, because it's just ridiculous. We are dealing with a physiological disease, making their life harder, or thinking if we hold back our love or hold back helping, is going to make them wake up one morning and go, oh, I see, I need to get help. We're dreaming. That's not how this works. That's not what this is. Tough love may work on a petulant teenager, and tough love may work on a drug addict, but tough love does not work with schizophrenia. It doesn't make sense.
Thank you for grabbing that question. I think that's important. And with that, thanking you, Mimi, very much. Thanking everybody who's been with us. I'm going to turn it back to Melissa Platt to close us out. Hey, Melissa.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank everyone for joining us today. This series has been powerful, informative, and compelling. While this is the end of the series, it is not the end of our efforts to provide education, advocacy, and programs for people living with serious mental illness. We hope that's true for everyone who's been involved in this. If you would like to see more events like this, please consider making a donation through our website. We will be hosting additional events like these in 2022, and you can check out our website or follow us on Instagram for more information. Thank you to our co-sponsors and everybody who's been involved in this, and we hope to see you in the future.